Dirty History is produced by Muckraker Media. So, if you value this show and podcast in general as an educational resource, please consider passing it on to another person. The best way we can spread is by word of mouth. That said, please consider subscribing and leaving a review on whichever platform you get this show. Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, wherever you get the show, please subscribe and review. The same goes for Muckraker Media. If you like this show, there are others on the network tailored to your interest. Go check them out at muckrakermedia.org. MUCKRAKER Media. This simple act, 4 minutes of your time, will help the show more than any dollar amount could, and it will help you curate a podcast feed you're proud of. So once again, wherever you get Dirty History, please subscribe, like, review, and be sure to check out Muckraker Media. And with that, on with the show. I'm Thomas Thompson, and this is Dirty History. On this episode, I sit down with science journalist Ian Graber-Stiehl. You may have read one of his many articles in Gizmodo, Nature, NPR, The Verge, Scientific American, Slate, Vulture, or Popular Science. But what really interested me in Ian is his eclectic taste as a writer. It pops up across his work, I may add, that often aligns with the values of Dirty History and its producer, Muckraker Media. In this conversation, we covered a wide range of topics, from Sci-Hub to the larger implications of the open source movement to the, I don't want to say controversy, but the discussion between popular science and academic science. Of course, we mentioned Carl Sagan. We discuss outreach as a combatant to misinformation, and we also spoke about Henry Ford and his anti-Semitic thought that spread through his mouthpiece newspaper. I hope you find this conversation as fascinating as I did, and of course, I hope it makes you think. And if it did, I want you to let us know. The conversation doesn't have to end simply because the microphones aren't rolling. So like, comment, review. Let's hear from you. Let's get a good conversation started. And as a general disclaimer, this was, of course, done remotely and over Skype, so the audio quality may dip in and out. At the very beginning, it is a little off-putting, but I do promise that it gets better the first couple minutes into the show. So I just want to give you a heads up with that. All right? So let's get down to it. All right, so let's go. In 3, 2, 1. Ian Graber-Stiehl, everyone. So I gotta admit, you got me curious about something, because it seems like you cover a wide range of topics. I mean, looking over some of your articles, I see a story on automated weather stations, a discussion on the clinical trial system. You consider reusable bags, people's lawns, an article on Olympic athletes and non-alcoholic beer. I mean, you have an eclectic taste. So I'm really curious on how you approach a story. Where do you start when you're working with a news story?
I think for me, there's a fundamental view I have that a lot of times when it comes to scientific writing, we have a tendency to lose track of what made us interested in science in the first place. Like, I'm willing to bet, actually, let me just ask you, when did you get interested in science? Like, if you had to point to a thing that made you get interested in science in the first place, what would it be?
See, actual science or actual mathematics in terms of doing the actual work never really interested me. It was always the history of those subjects and of those fields that were far more interesting, because I like the human drama behind the people who were doing the work. But I mean, of course, I'm always interested in just natural phenomena. I mean, you gotta ask your questions about climate change and whatnot. So really, college is when I came into having a love for science, but not necessarily a grounded understanding of the principles. I mean, I love all the writers I really enjoy, like, for example, John Dewey, who's a philosopher and an educational theorist, but he really harps on the scientific method as it could apply to schools. So I find the field interesting, but I don't have a working knowledge of the actual nitty-gritty in the fields, if
All
that
right.
makes sense.
Well, for me, and I think that for a lot of people, maybe it was something like dinosaurs. And for you, you said you like the idea of story behind it. Back when I was a kid, I used to carry around a dinosaur encyclopedia, and I think the answer ultimately is similar for a lot of people. In that moment when we first get interested by a scientific story or topic, we get interested simply because it's interesting. It's an inherently curious thing that we want to know more about. You show a kid a picture of a giant lizard-looking thing with feather covered in it and a jaw the size of its head, it wants to know more about it. And I kind of try to keep to that ethos. A lot of times we have a tendency to focus on scientific stories that have the best news hook. I mean, case in point, right now, I feel like it's been a bit of a pain to get anything published that isn't directly related to COVID or coronavirus. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, that's, the newsiness of a topic is not the thing that inherently gets us interested. And I think that that's a principle that's guided a lot of my writing, is rather than focus on what stories have the sexiest news hook, I tend to like to contextualize things that I already know about. People have a vague awareness of Charles Darwin, of the origin of species, and how it came about, but they don't know about his struggle with anxiety and with sickness, and how we likely never would have gotten the origin of species were it not for his issues with anxiety sort of sealing him away and forcing him to work on developing his base of scientific expertise. It's those sort of things I prefer, contextualizing stuff or just exploring topics that they might not have a news hook. Like you mentioned the article on sour beer. That has no relevance to anything in particular, but when you hear, some people made beer with wasp that was cultured from the gut bacteria, or from yeast that was cultured from the gut bacteria of wasps that feed on fruit, or cultured from a guy's beard, you inherently want to know more just because it's interesting.
Yeah.
So, that's pretty much it. I just try and look for things that I think are interesting or could use some context.
So you typically work from a place of interest. You have to be interested in the story before you would consider writing it.
I would say so, yeah. Most of it, I'd say an exception might be writing about something that I think is overlooked, that I would consider a crisis. Like I did an article for Nature about a year and some change ago on a hepatitis B crisis in sub-Saharan Africa. I never had a particular interest in hepatitis B, but during a random interview when a researcher told me that it was easier for people with HIV to get antiretroviral drugs that could also work for hepatitis B than it would be for regular patients, just because the money is there and it's been allocated for HIV, but it's not there for hepatitis B. When I heard that simple statement, that sent me down a rabbit hole, because I just figured that there's a crisis here that isn't getting the attention it deserves. So it's usually either one of those two things. I think that something just has the potential to be reported in an interesting way, or I believe that it merits a wider viewing simply because it's a rather important topic that people aren't paying attention to.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and you piqued my interest just by talking about that story. It seems like a massive oversight so people with HIV are more likely to get the hepatitis B drug than people with hepatitis B, you said? I'm just making sure I clarified that.
Yeah, throughout sub-Saharan Africa, actually worldwide, if you look at hepatitis B, it kills more people than tuberculosis, more people than malaria, more people than HIV. I think it's something like 1.34 million people die annually. And while there's been huge strides made in the Western, throughout China, throughout the whole Pacific region, throughout America and Europe, in lowering rates of hepatitis B, in sub-Saharan Africa, it's still lagging behind, and there's a growing industry for generic antiretroviral drugs that can treat it. But ultimately, in a lot of places, the best way to get such antiretrovirals is to have HIV. because you can use a lot of the same medicines, even if they're older ones, like lamivudine, I think is one off the top of my head. You can get access to that if you have HIV because there's no shortage of funding that's been directed, oftentimes through UN endeavors, to making sure people with HIV get those drugs. But if you have hepatitis B, in short, in a lot of places, you're screwed.
Huh. Yeah, no, that's really interesting. So, writing from a place of interest, because that's something that's I would say incredibly lucky to be able to write about things you're interested in. Do you ever have to work on assignment where you don't get to have a choice in the topics that you're writing about, or do you mostly work on what's interesting to you?
I would say yes and no. Um, so I typically, if you look at my publishing, I've written for a lot of places, but if you notice, I'm not exactly a columnist for or too regular in a lot of places. I've had stints where I've written news regularly for Discover or for a couple of other outlets, but that was mostly because I had a pretty close contact with an editor there, and doing those sorts of news stories, I don't particularly mind them. I mean, even if it's not something I'm all that interested in, usually news stories are, between 500 and 750 words, and usually the topic is still compelling enough. So I definitely don't mind that, but I tend to actively seek out stories that I find interesting. But of course, being a freelancer, that comes with the downside of allocating way too much time towards chasing down those stories and ultimately ending up broke.
well, that's a great point, and that kind of segues into another point, which is what ultimately drove you to pursue journalism, because you just mentioned that you're not, no one's going to make a pretty penny off of it, so it has to be from a place of interest and love, I assume.
I was in the military. I was a U.S. Army intelligence analyst, and I ended up leaving the military a little bit shorter than I expected. And I always love writing short stories. And when I landed back on my rear end in Illinois in 2015, I'd just been divorced from the Army, and I was feeling a bit lost. And I'd always loved writing. Short stories were my favorite thing, poetry as well. And so I thought, oh, I'm going to make a living writing short stories. And then that's when I realized, oh, that's right. Hemingway died a while back, and he'd be starving to death today if he tried to make a living off short stories. So that was right around the Paris Climate Summit, and I just noticed something people weren't talking about. Some loopholes regarding biomass energy, which is essentially burning wood pellets, being classified as renewable. And I figured, well, if nobody's talking about it, let me see what I can do. And that's when I just sort of jumped into it whole hog. I started doing research on smaller publications I could pitch to, and I ended up finding Pacific Standard, which sadly is defunct now, but it had poached some staff from the Atlantic, so I knew they had good standards in terms of the quality of articles they wrote, but they were small and approachable, and I pitched them. I got lucky enough for an editor, Ted Scheinman, to go ahead and give me a chance. And ever since then, I've always gravitated towards different areas of science. There are some things I typically stay away from. I don't go in too much into physics-based things. I don't cover cybersecurity too closely, but anything with biology or astronomy, I absolutely love to cover. So there's definitely I've always loved science. That's always been something in my heart. But in terms of actually writing, my background originally came from short stories that I just used to write in a notebook.
Yeah, so it's like this practicality meshed with your inherent desire. This is like the perfect field for you to go into. It's the marrying of your two loves, I suppose. Now, you mentioned short stories and Hemingway, and I'm staring at on my desk. I have my bookshelves, but I have three books that sit on my desk. I have The Secret Life of Salvador Dali, which is it was the reason it's on my desk is it's one of the first editions, and so it's an older book. And then the second one is the fifth column in the first 49 stories by Ernest Hemingway, which is my favorite work of Hemingway's. This is short stories. And personally, I would have died happy if he mostly only wrote short stories. I say that, but the Old Man with the Sea, Old Man in the Sea is one of my favorite books ever. I keep rambling, but I want to know any writers that had a major impact on you and your style.
Hmm. I feel like a lot of young men who get into writing and get introduced to Hemingway at some point. For a while, I tried to imitate him with writing. I read a bit of Faulkner, a lot of the transcendentalists. I was particularly fond of Robert Frost as well. I still have a tattoo on my arm that says "Miles to Go Before I Sleep." Um, but it wasn't just authors, I would say. I mean, I grew up on a lot of science fiction and on anime, and I mean, even like right now, I am working on a story that, originally it was sort of just a psychological short story, but I branched it out into science fiction after rewatching Ghost in the Shell a couple of years back. I decided I wanted to take another bend with it. So it wasn't just sort of classic literature. A lot of it was, surprisingly enough, bits of anime, bits of science fiction works as well.
So the reason I asked is because I originally became familiar with you and your writing through an article you did for The Verge in 2018. It was about Sci-Hub and its founder Alexandra Elbakyan, and I guess really about open access broadly. And if I may, the writing on that article is fantastic. I think you set the scene and the mood for the entire article in the first paragraph, and I have a few questions about it. But before we do that, I think the your first paragraph of that article is useful context for our audience. So if you don't mind, I'd like to quote it if that's cool with you.
Oh, sure thing.
So you wrote in the first paragraph of this quote, in cramped quarters at Russia's Higher School of Economics, shared by 4 students and a cat, sat a server with 13 hard drives. The server hosted Sci-Hub, a website with over 64 million academic papers available for free to anybody in the world. It was the reason that one day in June 2015, Alexandra Albacan, the student and programmer with a futurist streak and a love for neuroscience blogs, opened her email to a message from the world's largest publisher. You have been sued. You see, you're immediately pulled into that world. That's something you did for the reader. But I guess I'm curious, what pulled you into writing a story on Sci-Hub and its founder and open access? I know it's a little bit dated, but it was the first thing I read from you, and I find it really interesting. So, what pulled you into it?
Well, for one thing, if I'm being completely honest, I use the hell out of the service. Sci-Hub is essentially a group of sites that allow you to access the vast majority of published literature. And yes, there are ways for working journalists to also get around paywalls to access papers. It's easier for, I would say, staff journalists than for freelancers. But especially when I was starting out and I didn't have many credits to my name, and it was kind of a whole process to try and get approved for press credentials for anything. It was so much easier to simply copy the URL or the DOI, which is sort of a counterpart to a URL just for academic papers, paste it into Sci-Hub's site and be able to access all the scientific literature I need. And that made my work essentially possible. I genuinely do not think I would continue to be in this line of work where did I not have access to that service when I first started out. And yet, despite that, the more I looked into the person behind it, the more I realized that every article that had been written on it, you can kind of tell when an interview has been conducted via email. Everything sounds more stilted. There's not the organic flow of a conversation. You can tell when somebody just emailed a bullet point of questions and somebody responded. And I was reading around, I was like, nobody's actually spoken to them, have they? Nobody's spoken to Alexandra. So I just set about seeing if I could contact her. And I had loosely tracked this idea for maybe a year or so, but then I finally found some genetics company. Someone who worked there was associates with Alexandra, and they did a series of YouTube interviews. And so, I was able to find that person, get in contact with them, ask if they would put me in touch with Alexandra, and the rest is history.
Yeah. Well, would you agree that I guess before we get into that, maybe we should set the scene a little bit more. What is the problem, I guess, with Sci-Hub? Now, maybe not a problem that you have, but what is the controversy surrounding this website that I'm sure many of the listeners of the show probably use?
So I would say there's a couple of fronts here. So broadly speaking, it's piracy. It is out and out piracy. She is taking articles that are hidden behind a paywall, and she is allowing people to access them. Where a lot of people get into sort of the moral disagreements here is that the majority of research is public funded. So to a lot of open access advocates, the idea of then putting that research behind a paywall makes it sort of a twice pay product.
Mm-hmm.
The public's paying for it, but then they also have to pay to access the results. So that's what a lot of people would say in favor of her. On the other hand, publishers would allege that they add something of value. If a researcher were just to try and put his results in any random hole in the internet, it's not going to get much attention. But especially when you look at a publisher like Nature or Science, we're not just talking about simple copy editing here. I mean, they add metadata, they convert any and all information into common file formats. It's rounds and rounds of editing and typesetting, coming up with graphics, getting licensed photos to go along with it, sending out press releases to journalists. They even enforce what's known as an embargo period, where journalists get press releases several days before a study is actually run, and you're not allowed to report on that topic until that embargo is up, and that's creates sort of a competition. It's why, for any listeners that might not be familiar with it, it's why you get all these outlets reporting the same exact stories from the same handful of journals at the same time, because of that embargo period. So there's definitely something to be said for the value that publishers add to that product. And when she then immediately makes it available to all after, it depends what publisher you go to. I think the figures Nature would say, and again, Nature is in no way emblematic of the sort of resources that every publisher puts into a paper. But you look at some papers from Nature, and they would say that they put essentially $30,000 to $50,000 worth of capital into making that article ready to print and making sure that it goes in front of journalists. And now you've essentially made that free. Again, that's definitely not every publication. A lot of other ones would say that their fees that they rack up for just simple editing and publishing a story is a couple of hundred, a few thousand, but still there's that diverse there. Is this really a twice pay product when you take a lot of publicly funded science and you put it behind a paywall, or do publishers add something of value? And is it really that much of a problem when most of the people who need to access scientific information are academics themselves? So that's the moral diverge there.
Well, I can totally get behind that idea. Okay, publishers add value, and if they have to charge a price to put out this product in the way that they have, and most of the people reading this anyway are institutions, okay, fine. I can't accept that, but I can accept it. And so let's say, is there a consolidation, however, of these large research publication companies to where the control is getting more and more restricted to a few publishers than a larger, I guess, democratic market? Because it seems like, and I think you've even hinted to this in the article, that in 1973, for example, only 20% of academic scholarly research papers were published by the big five research publication companies, but that number seems to be increasing every year since 73.
Oh yeah, it's an out and out oligopoly. I wouldn't call it anything less. I mean, nowadays more than half of research is published by the same big five publishers, which are Reed Elsevier, Wiley Blackwell, Springer Nature, Taylor and Francis, and depending on what metric you use, either the American Chemical Society or Sage Publishing. So, I mean, and that's just a generalized number. If you look at fields like psychology, it's up to over 70% essentially. And it's not just a matter of the amount of articles being published by those handful of publishers. It's also a matter of political influence as well. All of these companies are lobbying interests. They do have a decent degree of political power. Not only have a number of them lobbied in favor of a number of bills that would restrict piracy, they've also lobbied against a number of bills that would try to make any publicly funded research, force it to go into an open access repository after some degree of time. In fact, a number of them had an outcry back in 2013 when the Obama administration declared that any research conducted by federal organizations has to be put in an open access repository within 12 months. And when these publishers haven't been able to get what they want via just out and out lobbying, they established court precedent. In fact, if I got it in front of me here, Elsevier is targeted about 17, Elsevier and 17 other publishers shut down the repository library NU, which was another piracy place. Elsevier and another publisher, the AAP, opposed the Federal Research Public Access Act bill, the Public Access to Public Science Act bill, the Fair Access to Science and Technology research. All of them would have aimed to make more research open access, and i.e. not hidden behind a paywall. And when that hasn't worked, they have not just sued a number of piracy places, but they're Elsevier and American Chemical Society being the most vehement in their lawsuits. They've oftentimes filed injunctions that have essentially put pressure on internet service providers to block not just piracy sites, but anybody that would be considered so-and-so aiding and abetting piracy sites, which is kind of a slippery slope. I mean, America got up in arms over SOPA and PIPA a couple of years back for essentially doing the same thing, but publishers are still sort of establishing precedents that would accomplish what those laws would have, simply by way of establishing a lot of court precedents that are saying it's okay to put the pressure on ISPs, not just to block a site that's guilty of piracy, but say to force a search engine not to show any results of any sites that maybe even contain a URL linking to that piracy site. That's kind of ham-fisted.
So you would agree then that the implications of this story reach far beyond academic publishing into considering the place of ISPs, payment platforms, and publicly funded research?
Oh, absolutely. I would say it's pretty wide-ranging, especially American Chemical Society's lawsuit against Sci-Hub and Alexandra Elbakyan. That one contained an injunction that was very direct, that a number of different sort of internet freedom groups have opposed. And I mean, even looking outside the U.S., for one, earlier last year, I think around November, Elsevier got Sci-Hub and Library Genesis 24 different domains of them blocked in Austria. And so a lot of people were using virtual private networks to get around them. And all the hubbub over Sci-Hub has, as of, I think, January earlier this year, got the Department of Justice investigating Sci-Hub and Alexandra Elbakyan over the idea that she could be linked to Russian intelligence, despite, as far as I'm aware, no real concrete evidence of that.
This definitely interests me. So at the center of this story, there seems to be this dichotomy between we have open access to information, the idea that institutional barriers to anything that could be conceived as an educational material, something you could learn from or expand your knowledge in a field, is just, in my opinion, a crime against humanity. I mean, this is not allowing people to have information that they can use and learn from. And then at the other end, it's the idea of this is property of someone, and they invested a large amount of money to make this a presentable product. Therefore, they argue that you should pay for it. It's a tough, as someone who loves and does a lot of research. It's a tough place to be in, where you fall on that argument. Do you see the larger implications of this story of this argument over open access? Do you see it affecting your career as a science writer in a meaningful way?
Well, I'd say the short-term answer would definitely be if they somehow manage to actually shut down all of Sci-Hub's domains, because as it is, several have been shut down, but it's like whack-a-mole. You keep popping up, Sci-Hub keeps popping up with new ones. If Sci-Hub and Library Genesis got shut down, my job would get, I would say, quite a bit harder. I'd have to put a lot more time into getting access properly to articles that I need to access for work. So I would say, simple answer, yes. For me specifically, I think that might be the biggest one. For more long-term stuff, publishers seem to be doing as much as possible to deflect attention away from open access repositories, which are essentially just what they sound like. They're repositories where you can put scientific papers where people can access them. A lot of them, like Archive or BioArchive, those are preprint repositories where you can put the rough draft essentially of your research in there and people can access it. There are other repositories where you can put the final product, but only after a certain period of time. Say you did research with the NIH. After I think it's 6 months or 12 months, the law forces that to be made open access, so people can access it through a paywall, or they can find a repository where now that paper has been put. The problem is that even though these repositories exist, it's a hodgepodge of different ones where it's difficult for the uninitiated to find them, to access the papers that they want, compared to just copying a URL and pasting it in Sci-Hub. And publishers, especially Elsevier, American Chemical Society, a few other ones, they've even formed consortiums like the Coalition for Responsible Sharing, I think it is, where they mention how you can access our open access research. And they mention a couple ones, checking their open access specific journals, trying to go through the paywall, a couple of other options. But one they don't make mention of is, you can go to these archives right here, or these repositories right here to access it that way. So it seems like a lot of publishers are sort of trying to educate people away from those options and to deflect people's attentions away from those options, deflect people's attentions away from sites like, say, ResearchGate, where sort of a social networking site for a lot of academics, where people tend to share papers. In fact, they've out and out sued ResearchGate for allowing people to do that. So I think that could be another long-term effect, not necessarily so much for me personally, but the idea of educating people away from these and also essentially reshaping internet infrastructure to direct people away from anything that could be possibly construed as aiding or abetting piracy. I mean, it's a very ham-fisted power there.
Yeah, no, and I think it's indicative of a larger trend. I mean, increasingly, I go online to read an article that pops up in my newsfeed, and it is not academic writing; it's popular writing, but it too is locked behind a paywall. And with so much information locked behind a paywall, I feel as though it becomes increasingly cost ineffective. I mean, for example, you wrote in the article that a year's subscription to a chemistry journal in the U.S. ran on average for about $4,773. The cheapest subscriptions were to general science journals, which only cost about $1,500 a year. I mean, as what could possibly account for such a high cost, or rather, I think the better question would be, this doesn't seem like something that universities could continue to fund. I mean, have you seen any evidence of that, of colleges having to say, we can't afford some of these journal subscriptions, we can no longer provide this to our students?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, really, the only effective way for a lot of people to access scientific literature, if they have to access a lot of it, is through institutions like colleges and universities, because they tend to make deals with publishers to pay a certain amount to access that. I mean, if you were just trying as an individual to get a subscription to these, good luck with the amount of money you're going to have to spend. Not everything you need is going to be published in one journal. So paying $1,500 for it, even on the low end, is kind of a bit ridiculous. So you'd have to go through an institution, and a number of institutions have started fighting back. I mean, and it's not just now. I mean, back in, I think, 2005, it was something like 7,000 or 17,000 academics wanted to petition to boycott Elsevier. And in more recent years, there's was like a consortium of German universities that went on something of a limited boycott against some of the big five publishers, against Elsevier, against Springer Nature, and they held out for quite some time before making a deal with them. And even then, they, rather than paying for their subscription to these journals, or to these publishers and all the journals that they produce, which, keep in mind, that's a wide umbrella. For something like Elsevier, they have thousands of journals under their title. Rather than paying a random subscription fee, rather now the universities are basing the fee off of the articles that they think they're going to publish through the service. And there's been different forms of deals made with them. More recently, a number of California universities, which essentially count for 10% of the sort of scientific research paper output in the U.S., have just held off of Elsevier services entirely. They haven't made a deal with them whatsoever. And there are some services that allow people to essentially loan or rent materials from one library through another. So a lot of people are using that. They're essentially, even though they're in that group of California universities, they are going through other libraries to access the materials they need. And from all intents and purposes, as far as we can see, it doesn't seem like it's been a major issue for those California universities. They seem to be surviving quite well without Elsevier's product, which kind of makes you wonder why some universities are paying hundreds of thousands of dollars to access these services. So a lot of universities are starting to push back more aggressively these days against the big five publishers.
Yeah. So let me run, I guess, this in plain English. The publishing companies have increasingly consolidated, with more and more work going to a smaller group of publishing companies. Thereby, these publishing companies are able to set prices for their journals, which have increased as years have gone on. And it's so prohibitive, in fact, that most people only get access to these journals through institutional means. But even then, institutions, for the most part, may not be able to keep up with this continued hiking in price. And then this is the other side of that. Let's say I work at a research center and it's publicly funded, meaning that either through grants or some other avenue, taxpayer dollars are funding my work. It's still possible then that work will end up behind the publisher's paywall, where essentially the average person who is a taxpayer ends up paying twice for the same product.
I mean, I'd say that's a pretty accurate representation of the lay of the land there. And I think it also taps into a broader discussion that we've been having. A lot of people might have heard of there being an issue with only positive results, positive correlations being published. I think the question here is, what extent of scientific data should be publicly available? Because we've talked about research that is funded by the public and whether or not that should be considered a twice pay product when it's hidden behind a paywall. A lot of people, I think, might agree that, well, if taxpayer money is funding this research, then it should be available to taxpayers. But what about when we have instances of private institutions who are funding research that is concerning, say, public health, but they tend to bury negative results or just not publish negative results of studies, and you only get the sort of positive correlations actually debuting in papers. There's an overarching question here, I think, of whether the issue should be looked at of is this a matter of should a project or should research that has been funded by the public be made public, or rather is it just a matter of research that concerns the public and has potential implications for public health and for public advancement? Should all of that be made public? And if you ask someone like Alexandra, who heads Sci-Hub, she believes in a philosophy that was pioneered by Robert Merton, the idea of scientific communism, which a major tenet of it is that all results of research should be made public because it all concerns the public. It is information for everyone. So I think that this whole issue sort of taps into that overarching philosophical question: is the matter here just public paid for it so public should access it, or it doesn't matter who paid for it? Ultimately, this all concerns the public. Should they have access to it regardless of the circumstance of how that research was created?
And that's from my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, that seems to be like a radical statement to make, that there is no differentiation, that all scientific research is public research. Because I mean, as far as I've seen, it seems like there's this divide between popular science writers and academic scientists, and it seems to be a contested one. I mean, I recall Carl Sagan ran into flack for doing Cosmos in his work with PBS. Is it true that the thought goes that, like, if someone's doing, you ask yourself, why is this person doing popular science? Why are they educating the public? If they're real scientists, why are they wasting their time with outreach? Shouldn't they be doing real research?
I feel like people have opened up a lot more to the idea of scientists devoting time to scientific communication, but the idea of the degree to which information should be made open access, that's definitely still a contentious thing. I mean, there's no unification really among open access advocates. Someone like Alexandra is on a very different level than, say, Peter Subert, who is, I believe, still the director of Harvard's Open Access Project. Someone like Peter Subert, he would advocate that you only achieve open access through legal means that would either be publishing in an open access journal, or if it's behind a paywall after a period of time, it has to be put in a repository. Versus, say, Alexandra, whose ideology would be something a lot more radical. It doesn't really matter who's paying for the research, whether you think it's twice paid or not. What matters is we say that we stand on the shoulders of giants, so why should not all of that information be shouted out from atop those shoulders? I mean, if this has been the culmination of work by so many people for so many people, then just give it to everyone.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of different schools of thoughts on this, and a lot less unification than someone might believe.
Yeah, and it seems, and the reason I keep pressing on you is because I think it's an issue that we are confronted with. I mean, even right now, and I mean, you spoke on how it's pretty much impossible to escape coverage on COVID-19 or the coronavirus in any kind of science writing, and that's the real focus. The open access movement might be part of the antidote for many people's concerns, because a large concern I see among people in academia is this idea that misinformation is so readily available. These conspiracy theory videos surrounding COVID-19 or the idea that it's, 5G is somehow spreading the disease and what. A lot of bad science and a lot of misinformation. I mean, would you agree with the statement that perhaps if open access was something that was more widely accepted, people could have access to real scientific research and data and be less prone to buying in to this misinformation that's so readily available?
I'm honestly not entirely sure because, on one hand, more information is great, but I'm not always sure more information is necessarily better information. While the rise of open access publications has been pretty conspicuous and I'd say great overall, I would say there's also a correlation between that and the rise of predatory publishers. Predatory publishers having somewhat of a similar business model in that they, like a lot of open access publications, they would charge a fee to an academic in order to publish that paper. And this doesn't apply for every open access journals, but a lot of them, like PLOS1 being one of the really big ones, I think PLOS charges something like 45. No, that was 1,500, I think, for PLOS1, and for scientific reports is $4,500 for an academic to be able to report their paper. And that's not necessarily out of pocket. A grant might be able to cover that. But still, a predatory publisher would have a similar business model. They oftentimes tend to more aggressively solicit scientists to send their research to them. They would charge the scientist a fee, and then they would rubber stamp it. And I think for the uninitiated who don't have a whole lot of experience in knowing what publishers are reputable and which one are not, because again, there are thousands of academic journals, and there's something like, I think, I want to say it was either 2.5 or 25 million. That's just a small order of a magnitude difference there. Papers published worldwide each year. That's very difficult for people to know whether or not they're accessing a genuine open access publication or a predatory one, unless they just stick to the big names. So I would say that I don't know if more information not necessarily qualifies as better information. Yeah. I think the problem there is just people aren't well equipped to deal with the information overload. People are taught how to, I mean, even in school, people are taught how to write a research paper, but how many people are taught how to really critically analyze information, how to see logical fallacies, how to accurately gauge the credibility of a site? I think we're still very much behind in that respect.
I know you can't see this, but my hands are in the air. I knew there was a reason I had you on the show. I could not agree more. I think it really boils down to an educational one. I would agree that more information is not necessarily good information, but if you were to supply more information and have a populace who is trained to critically read, break down, analyze, detect bias, all of these things in articles, I don't see how it would not be a net positive. I mean, I've never heard of an organization or a society or a group of people collapsing because they had too much information. Now, I've certainly heard of organizations and people totally discrediting themselves from misinformation, and I think this links in rather nicely to our whole conversation. I remember when we were emailing talking about doing this show, you immediately said, "This is a history show. I'm a sucker for all things history. Can we talk about Henry Ford?" And I think this falls into our broader conversation with misinformation and conspiracy and trained populace to detect these kind of things, and open access to academic writing. You want to tell us about Henry Ford for those who don't know necessarily about everything he's done? I mean, I think everyone basically understands that the Ford Motor Company, I mean, it was a huge and is a huge player in the American economy. But in 1918, Henry Ford purchases his hometown newspaper, Dearborn Independent. What happens next?
I need to thank you first because for the readers of this podcast, I'm just going to go ahead and address you directly. This wonderful gentleman here is allowing me an opportunity to just go ahead and talk about something that I've been wanting to write about for a couple of years, and nobody's particularly bidden. So understand that your wonderful host here is a very, very generous individual. I'll just leave that there.
I appreciate it. Creative freedom is all I'm about.
So Henry Ford, for some time, ran the Dearborn Independent, and people may be somewhat aware of Henry Ford's issues of anti-Semitism, but I think one of my favorite sayings about Henry Ford was, I'm trying to remember who said it. I think it was a reporter who once interviewed him said, outside of business where he's a genius, his mind is that of a child. He was quite susceptible to conspiracy theories and to accusations against people. And mind you, he did have a number of sort of forward-thinking policies in his factories. For example, he hired people really without regard for sex or race, but he did so because that benefited him and his factories. The Dearborn Independent became a mouthpiece for a lot of his anti-Semitism, to the extent that he even published a compilation of articles on essentially conspiracy theories about how Jewish people are controlling every aspect of society, which was compiled into a wonderful little pamphlet called The International Jew. It's a 4-set volume of anti-Semitic booklets and pamphlets. And it was actually a favorite read of Hitler. So much so that in Mein Kampf, there is actually only one American mentioned anywhere in the book, and it is Henry Ford. He's given the wonderful nickname Heinrich Ford by Hitler. Yeah.
So this seems to be the classic split, and one that I think is increasingly in the public consciousness, especially surrounding the Me Too movement and whatnot, is this the conversation about how do you or can you separate a person from their work? Because as you mentioned, Henry Ford, in his work with the Ford Motor Company, forward-thinking revolutionary individual, but his other endeavors, anti-Semitic, racist, I mean, it's hard to, you have to look at the whole person, but can you judge the person based on work and their other proclivities? It's a tough question, and I think he is emblematic of that.
I think for me in this case, it's more clear cut just because Henry Ford had one really good idea, production chain, and that was pretty much it. The rest of a lot of his career, how people tried to groom him for presidency, despite the fact that he didn't know about the American Revolution, yeah.
You can't just leave that hanging. What do you mean by that?
Oh, yeah, no, he really didn't have much of a concept about the American Revolution, period. He was full of a lot of misunderstandings about the history of America, and when interviewed, he just generally would always seem clueless. I mean, he was not a very well-educated individual in any respect whatsoever. And I think just about the only people who really gave him praise for his political ideas were, well, a lot of people who were in the Nazi regime in Germany. In fact, there was let's see, I'm trying to remember what the quote was. We look on Heinrich Ford as the leader of the growing fascist movement in America. We admire particularly his anti-Jewish policy, which is the Bavarian fascist platform. We have just had his anti-Jewish articles translated and published. The book is being circulated to millions throughout Germany. The newsman, upon investigation, found that Ford's books were indeed being distributed by the carloads. I mean, that was the sort of praise he got in Germany.
Yeah.
So I'd say for me is a little bit more clear cut, and what I found particularly interesting was his spats with, or I shouldn't say direct spats, but how his publication became a mouthpiece for what was known at the time as anti-Einsteinism or anti-relativity theorism, which was very thinly veiled anti-Semitism by a lot of German scientists who were trying to discredit Einstein and his theory of relativity just based off of the fact that he was Jewish.
Yeah, no, I think it's totally clear that Henry Ford is, anti-Semitic, and in judging him, I think that should be one of the front and center things. I mean, I was reading about the famous conspiratorial pamphlet, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and how he essentially republished that and distributed it in America to thousands of people as well. I mean, he did a lot to spread anti-Semitic thinking in the United States and abroad. Oh, what makes you so interested in the story?
Honestly, when I just heard that essentially Henry Ford had a publication that was serving as a mouthpiece against Einstein, and that it also it was related to this sort of consortium of scientists, which included 2 Nobel laureates of the day, who used this community that was being built simply around opposing Jewish science to take potshots at Einstein. That's another example of sort of the story behind the science that I find particularly interesting.
Yeah.
There was one researcher who had a column in the Dearborn Independent, Arvid Ruderdahl. He had a column that a lot of it ended up being based on making these sort of thought experimenty rhetorical arguments against the theory of relativity after it had already been proven that had no basis in mathematism. And a lot of it was based simply on Ruderdahl's objection to this nebulous concept, which he called the abstraction of science, which seemed to revolve around math being increasingly used in the field of physics rather than practical experimentation. And Ruderdahl became sort of I wouldn't necessarily say a confidant, but somebody who regularly communicated with German scientists back home, including Philippe Lenard and Ernst Gerck, and Johannes Stark. Johannes Stark and Philippe Lenard being two Nobel laureates of their day, who also wanted to oppose anything vehemently related to Einstein. And so the Dearborn Independent almost became this platform where all of these people were put in communication with each other to be able to try and to communicate on what they considered the issue of Jews and of what they called Jewish science. Why did I say science? I meant Jewish science. Pronounce that correctly. And it's just sort of a fascinating story to me of anti-intellectualism by what would otherwise be astounding intellects. Because ultimately the rejection here isn't based on any sort of scientific scrutiny. It was based off of not just fear of Jewish people, but among a lot of scientists, fear for their career and fear for their field. Because when the theory of relativity was published, it was oftentimes proclaimed as the death of Newtonian physics. That's not entirely accurate. It's more like it picks up where Newtonian physics leaves off. But all of a sudden, you had a lot of people who felt like their career, their field of study had been threatened. And so they acted reactively. They just acted reactively to that. And I think it goes to show that even people who can be highly intelligent, well-trained in rational thought, when we just have knee-jerk reactions to something, all of that can go right out the window, and we can devote undue time and effort to trying to discredit something not based on the merit of that idea, but rather just based on the strength of our fear.
Yeah, it reminds me of it's like a perverted version of the rhetorical device called Hitchens' razor. The idea that which is put forward without any evidence can also be dispelled without any evidence. But it's the distorted version that there's these things that are presented with evidence, but since you do not support the conclusions, therefore you dismiss it without evidence. It's this strange perversion. And I think it's actually a nice compliment to the last episode I just did on Dirty History, which was about anti-intellectualism in the United States. it's an interesting chapter in American history when looking at Henry Ford, and I think there's this strange relationship Americans have with American history that I find very interesting. There's people who just have a firm grasp of the national history or of international history. They understand the attitudes, the methodology of doing history. And then there's some who take a mythologized version of US history where it's not really history. It's basically mythology, a patchwork of stories. I mean, when you learn about Henry Ford in school, I don't really remember much about the Dearborn Independent or anti-Semitism. What you hear about is the production line and the making of the modern American industrial system and things like that. There's pieces that get left out.
There's a saying I try to keep, which is disgust and fear of the death of debate. And I would say disgust in particular, because the things that disgust us are the things we make the least effort to understand. Even things that we fear, curiosity can sort of bring us back into it. But let's just, if I were to just think of something that invokes disgust right off the top of my head, I'll just bring, let's try this, one word, incest. Immediately, some of your viewers probably just recoiled. That's a word that it has such a deeply ingrained thing of disgust to it that you probably never in your life tried to contemplate or figure out why someone might think that or be attracted to that or anything along those lines. When we are disgusted by a thing, we don't want to understand it. We don't want to put forth any effort, even when there may be some merit to understanding the psychology or the sociology behind something. And for a lot of people, something like evolution can evoke the same sense of disgust. And for a lot of American history, it did, because it so inherently goes against something core to someone's personal belief that they immediately react against it, and they don't want to take the time to try to understand it. So I think this is sort of another story of that. A lot of the scientists here were reacting either out of fear or disgust. Some people fear for their field, other people disgust out of an entire group of people, to the point where the arguments against the thing they were making many times had nothing to do with science whatsoever. They were willing to set aside the system of inquiry and analysis that they have been trained in over the course of decades, something that had been the founding of their being, to just knee-jerk at something simply because that's instinct.
Everything you just said there, I have so many notes that I took down because you hit on so many different central tenets of dirty history. I mean, the tagline, for example, of our website and of the podcast is "Discussing the Disgusting," where that's our main focus. I mean, I'm working on an episode on the psychology of disgust right now, and you kind of the speakers didn't do you justice when what was that word you said automatically triggers a disgust response? Did you say incest?
Yeah, I said that one, but I think there's, perhaps now that I think about it, there's another good example, actually from an Atlantic article I read a while back. It was several years ago. They had an article that was written by a pedophile. Not a child molester, but a pedophile. Mm-hmm. And there's a difference between those two. One is one that has an attraction to children. Another one is somebody who's actually acted upon it to assault someone. But nobody ever makes an attempt to distinguish between these. And just the fact that the Atlantic had somebody who came out as a pedophile write an article in there, a lot of people reacted very strongly against that when that article was published a couple of years ago, without even reading the article whatsoever, because that immediately triggers disgust. We don't want to understand the things that discuss us, even if there's value in understanding the psychology there, and to help people away from potentially isolating themselves to the point where they reach what I call the precipice of, and pardon my French, I don't know the standards for language on your podcast too well, but what I call the precipice of Mount Fuck It, which is the point at which somebody feels such a sense of loss or isolation where they just say, fuck it, I'm just going to do what I want to do. And that's this story for a lot of pedophiles who turn into child molesters. That's the point. That's the psychology of a lot of things, I think. And to understand where someone is coming from, even if you don't want to, can ultimately help you understand how to avoid tragedy. But we don't want to do that because we're disgusted by the very thought, the very concept, the very word, of something like pedophile, that we just want to distance ourselves away from it.
No, I totally understand that, and I'm in the same boat as you are. I think there is merit in discussing these things. I mean, I've made an entire podcast out of it, where it's particularly I take issue with your idea that incest is inherently this thing that disgusts people. If anything, I would say that if you look at pop culture, we have this strange obsession with it. I mean, think of like Game of Thrones or what was it? The one show called Taboo. There's plenty of TV shows and pop cultural examples of this. It's just it's such an interesting topic to me. I don't want to get into it too much because it's an upcoming episode we're doing, but I found it very interesting that you mentioned that as an example. But this has been great. I really appreciate you doing this.
It's been absolutely a pleasure. I'm definitely going to have to set aside some more time to stay up to date on the podcast. I regret that I hadn't heard of it before you reached out to me, but you got another viewer.
That's fantastic to hear. I mean, that's people think I have guests on because I love to talk to people. It's really just a covert way of spreading the show to other people. No one's in on that secret yet, so no, I'm just messing with you. I really I enjoy your work. I enjoy your writing. Definitely, I'll be checking to see when you have new stories up. I find you a refreshing science writer. It's readable. It's as a human element to it. I really buy into it. So again, thank you. You do fantastic work. And anywhere where people can stay up to date with what you're working on, you got a Twitter or something like that?
I would say Twitter is probably one of the better ones. So is Muckrack. If you really want to keep up to date, Muckrack is just type Muckrack into Google and then type in my name, Ian Graber-Stiehl. You'll come up with me. And Twitter, let's see if I can remember my Twitter handle off the top of my head. I can. Steel Point Pen, because yeah, I know that's very bad. I don't know why I didn't say steel writing, but it's spelled like my last name, Stiehl, and then point and pen. And God, I regret not making that steel writing. That would have been clever.
No, I enjoy it. I'll be sure to put those in the description of the show. And Muckrack should be easy enough for everyone to understand. Our producer for this episode is Muckraker Media, which is a nonprofit podcast network which aims to apply the principles of open access to educational material broadly beyond science writing. So I think there's this nice connection between what we're talking about here and what my actual mission is overall. And I'm surprised how well this all came together. I mean, kind of all of our topics have this nice through line. It's going to be pretty easy to categorize once I put it up.
Yeah, although, I mean, towards the end, though, it started sounding like hentai attacks, but I digress. But this has absolutely been one of the more pleasurable interviews I've been able to do. You know what? I will say, though, the coffee I'm drinking now is far better than the one that they served over at NPR, but that's mostly because I'm doing this interview on my end from my house. So this probably puts it over NPR just for that reason. The coffee's better.
You heard it here, folks. That's the endorsement I've been looking for. That's what we need. Hey, thanks again.
All right, you have a good day. Stay safe.